Change.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The largest egg recall in U.S. history is bringing renewed attention on the dangers of factory farming and ongoing consolidation in the industries responsible for the food many Americans eat. Over 500 million eggs have been pulled off U.S. shelves in the past 2 weeks following an outbreak of salmonella in the Midwest. Nearly 1,300 cases of people sickened by the eggs have been reported. Despite the size of the recall, responsibility falls on just 2 factory farms, Hillendale Farms and Wright County Egg, both from Iowa. Both farms have also been linked to health, safety, and employment violations. Wright County Egg was once cited for having its workers handle manure and dead chickens with their bare hands. Neither factory had ever been inspected by the top federal and state agencies responsible for food safety oversight: the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Agriculture, and the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. In an interview with CNN, FDA Commissioner Margaret Hamburg acknowledged the factory farms linked to the outbreak had violated safety rules.
There is no question that these farms that are involved in the recall were not operating with the standards of practice that we consider responsible. And it's very, very important that those practices be cleaned up and that we work with this company and with others to make sure that they have the preventive controls in place and the responsible measures in place that will enable the safest food supply possible.
The FDA Commissioner Hamburg went on to urge passage of food safety legislation that stalled in the Senate since the House approved it just over a year ago. The measure would allow the FDA to order a recall instead of leaving it up to corporations to voluntarily do so. The bill would also require mandatory safety plans, increase FDA oversight, and make it easier to determine the source of contamination. For more on the egg recall and what it could tell us about the food we eat, we're joined by 2 guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Patty Lavera, Assistant Director of the Food Safety Group Food and Water Watch. And here in New York, David Kirby, journalist and author of the book Animal Factory: The Looming Threat of Industrial Pig, Dairy, and Poultry Farms on Humans and the Environment. His latest article in the Huffington Post is called Lessons from the Egg Recall: Cheap Food Makes You Sick. Okay, David Kirby, let's start there. What do you mean?
Well, these are the cheapest eggs on the market. The reason they are cheap is because they are mass-produced in these giant, often filthy factories, given substandard feed in conditions that you would never raise a dog or any other animal. The drive for cheap food has created a consolidated food production system that pushes out small and independent producers that tend to produce higher quality food. Chickens that live in a sustainable farm produce eggs that are far less likely to be contaminated with something like salmonella than these big factories, which, as you mentioned, are basically allowed to police themselves. And we need much stricter, not only regulations, but we need enforcement of the regulations. Right now, we're operating on the honor system, and this is food that we feed our families. So this should be the most highly regulated industry.
These 2 factory farms in Iowa, under, 30 or so different names, are now being recalled, something like 500 million eggs. 2 farms, 500 million eggs.
Again, that shows you the scale of these operations. It's possible to have salmonella in a small organic farm, much less likely. But if that happens, you're only talking about maybe a few thousand eggs. In this case, we're talking about 500 million eggs. Now, these farms or factories really are associated with a company called DeKoster. And when I was in Iowa and in other states in the Midwest, that name came up over and over again. This company has a whole series of violations. But we have to remember, this is not the first time that salmonella has been found in eggs. This happens to be one of the biggest outbreaks. But this has been plaguing the egg industry for the last 20 years or so, ever since modernization and industrialization really came into place.
Let's go to Patty Lavera and let's follow up on DeKoster. Both the factory farms that are affected in this recall are linked to a businessman named Austin DeKoster, who has a record of health, safety, and employment violations. As we reported yesterday, in 1997, his company, DeKoster Egg Farms, agreed to pay a $2 million fine after then Labor Secretary Robert Reich said conditions at his farm were as dangerous and oppressive as any sweatshop. In 2002, DeCoster's company paid $1.5 million to settle a lawsuit filed by the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission on behalf of Mexican women who reported they were subjected to sexual harassment, rape, abuse, and retaliation by supervisors at his plants. And earlier this summer, another company linked to DeCoster paid out $125,000 to the state of Maine over animal cruelty allegations. Patty Lavera, talk about DeCoster and his eggs.
Well, I mean, DeCoster is a name you hear a lot when you start talking to people either who know about the egg industry or are from Iowa or Ohio or the other states that he operates in. And so we think it's basically he's kind of a poster child for what happens when we see this type of consolidation and this scale of production. It's not just food safety or just environmental damage or you know, how workers are treated. It's a whole package of negative side effects when we have this type of massive production responsible for so much of our food. So, you know, the two firms involved in this recall, it appears that they had a common supplier of feed. They may have had a common supplier of the baby chickens, which are eventually going to lay the eggs. We've seen consolidation through every step of this chain, and what that does is put so much power in to make decisions about how our food is raised with people like Jack DeCoster or his family, and not us. You know, we see a lot of brand names in this store, but we don't really have a choice because we have such consolidation. So much of the food is coming from a tiny number of companies.
Talk about the legislation now in Congress.
So the food safety legislation passed the House last summer, and it's been waiting for its turn in the Senate. And so it would basically be an overhaul of what the Food and Drug Administration does. The FDA is responsible for shell eggs, which is what's involved in this recall, for produce, fruits and vegetables, for processed foods. And so it's really taking a look at their whole regulatory system. You know, they don't have the same model as meat inspection. A lot of people are familiar with what the USDA does. They're in the plant inspecting meat because they have a law that tells them to do that. The FDA doesn't have that mandate. They have a much more kind of guidance-oriented mandate. And so for years they've been saying these are best practices. Please follow them, you know, and they don't have this culture and this authority to go out and inspect. So this legislation is one attempt to do that. It's been a long slog to try to get to